Just waiting for that little red light to go on. Should hopefully pop on soon. Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see everybody tonight. Really great to see everybody. All right, everyone, welcome. This is Religious Studies 3300 with Mr. Smith at Tennessee Tech. It is Martin Luther King Jr., the Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change. This is class number 3, January 26, 2022. Begin as we should with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., especially because a lot of the content in the first portion of tonight's class comes from anti-racist activists who are post-King. So a lot of the vocabulary and vernacular of movement work has changed and nuanced over the decades since Dr. King's tragic assassination, the more than 5 decades. But this quote from King, and I will bring King in periodically to the first part of today's class, but this quote from King really strikes at the core of what I hope to accomplish in this class. He wrote, "If physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children and their white brothers from an eternal psychological death, then nothing can be more redemptive." And King believed that a person must be willing to give up their entire life, like die in martyrdom or in war or whatever, that a person should be willing to sacrifice their entire breathing life to help other people. And he believed the cause of abolishing the triplicate evil of materialism, which he put both communism and capitalism under that, abolishing racism and militarism, was a cause for which he was willing to die. And if you just think about that concept of the triplicate evil, which I brought up in the very first class, and we will refer to without fail throughout the semester: racism, militarism, materialism. These isms are systems. So if a person would say, well, Dr. King, he didn't really talk about systemic racism, I would beg to differ. He actually had a very strong systemic critique of what is wrong in the world. And there's a phrase that he used in the pages that we have already read for the autobiography that he uses twice in the section that was assigned. He refers to the problem of collective evil twice in the early section of that autobiography, meaning he's not talking about my personal bad behavior or Pastor Lack's personal bad behavior. It's actually together what we do in institutions like the church, institutions like the school, institutions like commerce or finance or the government. Okay. The Romans, I'm sorry, the John 3:16 of anti-racism and gender inclusion is Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew nor Greek. There is no longer slave nor free. There is no longer male nor female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And this idea that God, through the person of Jesus, abolished our preoccupation with hierarchy based on gender, race, class, sexual orientation, is profoundly biblical. And so from a theological perspective, which is the two theories of this class that kind of underlie, that's the water we're swimming in the semester, rhetoric and theology. Here's theology straight up that would show us the way outside of a way of racism. Now, of course, a text like Galatians 3:28 can be quite cheapened because we're not, at least I'm not, advocating the abolition of difference. I'm advocating the celebration of difference, and we cannot celebrate difference if we don't see difference. So I've already dropped the phrases in my preamble tonight of the phrase post-racial colorblind. This talk tonight is in no way advocating that we just pretend that everything is equal and fair and the same, that actually this difference is profound. It's worth noticing, it's worth talking about, it's worth celebrating when it doesn't result in the suffering, the wholesale oppression, and it taking advantage of others simply based on what category one finds oneself in. But this is the Bible, unedited, right up here, saying that we are not to be judged on these systems like gender, race, status, even the status of whether one is incarcerated or enslaved. One of the terms that became very popular to talk about anti-racism in the church was coined by Reverend Jim Wallace out of Washington, D.C. in the Sojourners Group, a child of Detroit like myself, much older than me, came up in the 60s and 70s. And this phrase was used by former President Bush in the statement that he and Laura Bush issued after the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, of this idea of America's original sin. Now, let me just say straight up, the topic, calling something a sin, that seems to be triggering for a lot of people right now. And even the topic of original sin is among the theologians in the room. If you are, this is a religious studies class, you might fashion yourself as a theologian. You might be aware that even within the religion of Christianity, people debate this construct of original sin. And of course, some of you might not be, a Christian, and you might have a different faith tradition, or you might have no faith tradition, and that would be absolutely fine. But Jim Wallace says this about racism. He says, racism is a perverse sin that cuts to the core of the gospel message. Put simply, racism negates the reason for which Christ died, the reconciling work of the cross. Reconciliation, of course, is whatever comes after a conflict, which is unity and healing. And you know that in the nonviolence principles we studied the first 2 weeks of the course, that that King talked about reconciliation a lot. There's only one remedy for such a sin, and that is repentance, which, if genuine, will always bear fruit in concrete forms of conversion, changed behavior, and reparations. Well, we haven't done that fully, right? As a society, we haven't dealt with that. And lately, at least if I'm to believe what I'm reading and hearing on the news, we've decided that we're never going to do that, and that we shouldn't do that, and that it's actually wrong to even suggest that such a thing even ever happened. So this is a controversial statement, and I understand that in your community, wherever you reside, you might be hearing this and you might be having some questions. Was slavery a sin? And if so, what does repentance from the sin of slavery actually look like? So this talk tonight, this is my disclaimer for the people that get triggered by this kind of stuff. And I don't mean, there's some stuff in here that I think you guys might be triggered. I'm going to talk about a text that was a racist text from 100 years ago that I found very triggering when I pulled it out tonight. And I read it to my spouse before I got on the call, and I could tell she didn't want me to read it to her because it was so horrible, right? But this talk is so present to this moment that we're living in right now, and everything that the United States is going through right now. I want to make sure that you understand that that I've studied and prepared this talk, and I've sat with it in my mind and my heart, and I believe that I'm presenting sound academic information that is reliable and truthful. But I understand that a controversy in an academic setting is something on which good people can disagree. And so if there's something that any person listening to this talk, maybe I'll put this recording on the internet and somebody will find it and take issue with this talk. Let me just say it to where everybody can hear me. If you disagree, that doesn't make you a bad person because you disagree with any of the claims made in this talk. And it doesn't make me a bad person for researching and studying and making these claims. While rooted in a vetted theological, sociological, and academic idea, the contents of this lecture are by their nature confrontational, controversial, and open to debate. Moreover, teachings about white privilege see white communities as their audience, so they may respond proactively for just relations. And I think one of the things that people object to is that as a white activist, I don't feel I ever have a place to be, the tutor to Black activists in movement work. In movement work around racial justice, I listen to Black voices. I learn to take a seat. I try not to always center myself. And just even by the virtue of the fact that I'm a faculty member in this class, I'm doing this work as solidarity work in support of Black social justice warriors. And I'm doing this to move myself and my fellow white folks along and to take responsibility for my role and my complicity and my participation in white supremacy, and to repent from my internalized racism that I've the cup that I've sipped from just by being a white male, white cisgender heterosexual male in America for the last 54 years that I've been on this planet Earth. And so I just tell it like it is, but I found, and I'm not trying to be radical or anything like that, far from it, I'm a kumbaya, let's hold hands and sing kumbaya kind of guy. But I have found in my work that just simply stating the truth about topics like this makes some people very uncomfortable. And so I'm taking responsibility for this, and especially for my fellow the students, especially who are white. Give me some feedback. You can give me feedback on the call today. You can give me feedback over email privately. My black students, give me some feedback. What are those crazy white people talking about, and how does this synchronize up with your experience as far as you've experienced it? So this is tonight's talk: to free white people from psychological death. That is the claim that King was making, is what his cause was in that quote. And of course, to save everybody from death, but especially to free us from the prison of our own minds. White racism, privilege, and solidarity, understanding America's systemic sin, and toward a theology of race. And these are tentative proposals that I've made, and I document each of my sources. In my slides, I just name the source from where that idea is taken. And therefore, I'm not that original, and I just study a lot, and I try to synthesize what I've studied to make it available to others. And so actually, if it's something's really objectionable, you can also take it up with the theorists and the authors that have informed my positions, as you'll see them here. So let's just begin with like a most rudimentary understanding of what this is. Race as a reality does not exist. There is actually no such thing using any agreed upon rubric. Okay, so if there was an agreed upon rubric that everybody agreed upon, and this is what these categories were based on, we could have a consensus on what race is. Such a thing simply does not exist. It is a construct. And when I say that something like race or gender is a construct, that doesn't mean that what you experience in your light-skinned body, or your dark-skinned body, or your female, you're understood as female body, you're understood as male body. I'm not saying that these things aren't real. I'm not saying that there aren't real correlations to these constructs, but I'm saying that how we talk about them in society is made up and propped up by generations of discourse. Okay, and so we're language making and meaning making machines as human beings, and so we cannot separate our understandings of this from language. And from a linguistic or a biological or a theological point of view, the construct of race is completely invented and made up. And my understanding is that it was made up by white people in order to create a system where they would be in charge and in power. And that before the white people came up with the idea to make that contention, it really didn't even exist. Homosexuality, they say, oh, it's in the Bible. No, because homosexuality is also a social construct. It did not exist until probably the 19th century at the earlier. Did same-gender romance exist before the 19th century? Well, of course it did. But this construct of this category called homosexuality is a modern invention. So race biologically is a myth. And there's a great video you can get out of the library or probably find on YouTube called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And they actually show you the science, like the actual science between toward the non-existence of race. And one of the analogies they use is they showed that people who have the same complexion can have they showed that there was genetic similarities between humans that transcend skin pigmentation, and that basically we're all the same. Actually, what the science is showing is that we're made of the same stuff. Now, some people say we're made in the image of God, and this is a theological class as well as a rhetorical class, and so we can say that here safely academically, that this idea that we're made in the image of God is one explanation for that. But then in the same film, Power of an Illusion, they showed that penguins that look exactly alike have more diversity from penguin to penguin than we have from human to human in terms of our internal genetic diversity. Let me say that again. One penguin to the next that look the same on the outside have more genetic difference between two penguins than I do with any any of the students on this call, regardless of our gender or our race. Okay, and same with the world. We're all humans. So there's actually a scientific basis for an old Sunday school song. It went something like this: red, brown, black, and white, we are all the same in the good Lord's sight. There's science to back this up. So Howard Winant defines race as a concept that signifies and symbolizes socio-political conflicts and interests in references to different types of human bodies. And so we can see that we have different bodies, and these different bodies have been sociologically placed in these categories, and conflict has arisen. So race is the concept that acknowledges that conflict between different types of human bodies and different communities of human bodies that historically have organized around some of these superficial pretend similarities, right? Okay. Now I'm going to give you something from a textbook, and this is the part that's really triggering to me. And I don't endorse this, right? So don't screenshot. Get out your cell phone right now and screenshot Smith. Take this out of context. Put it on YouTube, and and I'll be like that professor in that Netflix show. Okay. So I go trash digging all the time, and I go free box, flea market, used bookstore, antique store. But I always, if they have a free box, I always go to the free box first, because I'm a hoarder. I'm sorry, I have to admit it. I like stuff, and I also like stuff that's free. So I picked up this textbook from 100 years ago, and it's really old, and it's called The Higher Geography. Okay. And I'm just going to read you just a couple of short passages out of The Higher Geography. These are passages that I find completely, patently offensive and wrong and not okay. All right, so I'm not endorsing what you're about to hear, but this is out of an actual textbook from about 115 years ago. It came out in the early part of the 20th century. If we were to travel through all the countries, we should see many different classes of people. We may divide them into 5 great groups called races. And then they go on and say that the 5 great races are the black race, the red race, the brown race, the yellow race, and the white race. Those are the 5 races. And they start talking about black people in an indigenous context. Okay, so these would be African people living in their indigenous homelands in Africa before white civilization has gotten there. And this is a children's textbook. This is a school book for kids. It says, such natives are ignorant. They know nothing of books. In fact, they know little except how to catch and cook their food. Such people are savages. Okay? And then at the very end, and then they go through all the different races, and then they save the white race for last. And and this is only a couple pages. I mean, this is written for like a fourth grade level. At the very end of it, it says, the white race outnumbers even the great yellow race. These 2 races account for 6/7 of all the people of the earth. And this is what this textbook for children says about white people. They are the leading race in the world in commerce, power, art, and intelligence. So when somebody says to you, we never taught white supremacy in school, and so now in schools, to point out that we once taught this in schools, it's illegal now in Tennessee. This is I'm not K-12, and so far I haven't gotten any memorandums yet, that I'm not allowed to say this. But right now in Tennessee in K-12, it is illegal to point out that we once taught stuff like this to children. Okay. They might go back to this textbook. They're taking Martin Luther King Jr. out of like kindergarten now. Okay. But that's a bunch of bull. That's a lie. That is a lie. And Martin Luther King Jr., I can't remember the speech where he says it. He says something along the lines of, I am not ashamed of who I am. I'm ashamed of the people who thought that they could make me ashamed of who I am. So, if there's nothing else that you take away from tonight's talk, race is a human made-up construct. It's an illusion. But racism is so real that we have to keep talking about it until it's been completely abolished and it's an unknown. And see, the thing about it is, I believe there's some genuine goodness in everybody's heart. So I think what these folks are trying to say is they think that we've already got to that place, in the I Have a Dream speech, where racism doesn't exist anymore. And so therefore to talk about it existing previously is like going to make make the sons and daughters, the granddaughters and the great granddaughters and the great grandsons of Ku Klux Klan members have PTSD or something. But unfortunately, they've now used this as a wedge issue, as a recruitment tool for the new white nationalist and white supremacist movement in the United States. They're not calling it the Ku Klux Klan anymore. They've got new costumes that they wear, but they have costumes. Look up the videos from just this last weekend of the Patriot Front marched in a couple different cities in the United States, a white nationalist, white supremacist organization. They're on the offensive, and some people are talking about it. Some people aren't talking about it. I'm going to talk about it because it's going to destroy America as we know it if we don't, join together to do the Kingian thing and participate in nonviolent social change to deal with those triplicate evils that still exist in our world. All right, I'm going to go through I'm going to rattle through several scholarly concepts that undergird this talk, and I'm taking just straight out of textbooks that other people have written. So first of all, some people don't want to use the term racism, and I said at the beginning of the talk that I've been frustrated over the years that people really, when you say racism, people have no idea what you're talking about, and so some activists today prefer these two terms. One is white supremacy, and one is anti-blackness. Now, we don't prefer the things that they represent, but those terms are maybe a little bit clearer than simply talking about racism, because some people perceive racism as just this very bland and generic thing that any group can use against any other group. And I'm only talking about what it's like to be white or black in the United States of America, where we have a particular history. I didn't make those people do those things. You didn't make those people do those things. But we have to accept that we have an inherited reality that is directly dependent on those things. Wealth, inherited wealth can be traced right back to the plantation system and all of its evil injustices by people who thought that they could own other human beings and make money off of it. It was an investment in profit by people who didn't work and making other people do the work for them. It's capitalism, and it's racism, and it's Christianity, all in a nutshell here today, because we're going to learn, unfortunately, the master went to church too, and he thought the church justified his abominable behavior towards the humans that were brought here in those slave ships. Okay. White racism. So I'm talking about a system where white people have the advantage. So I'm going to use a term here later, but it doesn't exist. And if you hear somebody talk about it, they're talking about bias or bigotry or ignorance, or just somebody is being stupid. And stupidity, unfortunately, it goes around in all cultural milieus. I've been in lots of cultural milieus, and I've never been in one where there isn't a little bit of like error or mistake or stupidity, or people just say ignorant things. And so I'm not saying that there's a system of humans being human and making mistakes. What I'm saying is, in fact, something quite different. I'm saying that the system of racism, and King thought it was a system, functions to advantage white people, period. And that's what I'm trying to say. So it's a system of advantage based on race. It's socially organized set of attitudes. And that's Beverly Tatum who said that. It's a socially organized set of attitudes, ideas, and practices that deny African Americans and other people of color the dignity, opportunity, freedom, and reward that this nation offers to white Americans. So these are a couple different academic definitions of racism. So if it's a system of advantage based on race, there's one race in power and the other groups are not. This systemic, institutional, or structural racism is not the same thing as prejudice. So, like I said, if you make a stupid remark against somebody, I mean, when I was a kid in school, I went to a predominantly black school, and by the way, growing up in the black community influenced me to think about these topics, the way that I do. But I got called a honky. I didn't like being called a honky. At the time, I didn't think it was meant in a particular way. Today, I might call another white person a cracker. That's not a nice thing to say. That's a mean thing to say, to call somebody a cracker. I shouldn't do it. And if I do it, I do it, kind of tongue in cheek, pejoratively. But there's no such thing systemically as reverse racism. There is no system of black power or black supremacy operative in the United States today. It doesn't exist. Now, there's been civil rights activists who are to a different category than King, who have advocated for a black nation, a separate nation in the United States, a black homeland within the United States that would be exclusively black, and that would there's these weird echo chambers where some white nationalists and some black nationalists are friends, and they want to they'll divvy up the nation. They'll carve the nation up into these different ethno states, and all the ethnic groups will have their own part of the country. These are the things people on the fringes talk about. That's not something that I understand America to be. And one of the other things and one of the reasons why King, I think, is maybe considered a safe person to convey a systemic critique of racism, because he clearly believed in it, was that King believed in America. I think one of the criticisms of this kind of discourse today is that they perceive it as automatically anti-American. Well, King is as pro-American as it gets. He strongly, vehemently, passionately believed in the democratic ideals. He believed in our founding documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. He truly believed in the rule of law, and he believed that the government could be used for good. One of the things is when they integrated some of the schools. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to the South. He said, "I believe in the correct use of police to enforce law," and he believed that a lot of the things that he was fighting to were so boiled into the system democratically that's why they would be victorious. And of course, these other things might not be boiled into the founding documents, but they might be cooked into some of the other institutions anyway. But you might hear somebody say, well, that's reverse racism, or he's racist against white people. That's not really what I'm talking about today. I'm not saying that people can't be mean or stupid or do terrible things and be motivated by hate from other ethnic groups. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that there's a unique purchase that the white majority in the United States has on racism. And the way Reverend Wallace breaks it down is he says that prejudice may be a universal human sin, but racism is more than an inevitable consequence of human nature or social accident. It is a system of oppression for a social purpose. And if you study the thing, there are some arguments can be made that it was done on purpose, it was done strategically, and it was done in broad daylight where everybody can see that the agents and operatives of white supremacy are proud of their views. And so you have certain people today that are in the news, that are in the media, and that are in politics who aren't ashamed or they see no more conflict within themselves to use these dog whistles, to use these code words to rile up a crowd. And this is on television. This is in politics today. And so that's when people say, that there's a white nationalism and white supremacy in American mainstream politics today, they're not talking about made up stuff. There's people that are monitoring this. There are watch groups that study this, and they're documenting, specifically, every time that these things happen. So due to all of these factors and their loaded and misunderstood emotional power, some activists and scholars do not like the term racism at all, but prefer to say white supremacy and anti-blackness, which I've said already in this lecture. But there's a slide to bring it home, just to be clear what they're talking about. Now, white privilege is something that's totally different than racism, and people for some reason, they don't want to talk about white privilege. Nobody wants to admit, that they were born on the 1 yard line, with first and goal. And they get a touchdown on the fourth try, that they're the same as the person who runs it back 99 yards. I mean, if you only had to go 1 yard and you got 4 tries and somebody else had to go 99 yards on 1 try, that's not the same thing. Each team got the touchdown. But don't tell me that it's just as easy to go 99 yards on 1 play as it is to go 1 yard on 4 plays. And some of y'all were born on the 1 yard line. And I don't know if anybody on this call was born on the 1 yard line, but there's some folk that got born on the 1 yard line. And they predominantly are white and in our society. That's just the way history happened. Am I proud of that? No, I'm not. I think it's dishonest and disingenuous to the core to pretend that that actually didn't happen, and that still isn't happening, because it is. And so this is where the rubber meets the road. People are like, well, are you saying that every white person benefits from these privileges and is therefore part of the system and structure of white racism? It's like every white person is a racist. Man, that's a really harsh thing for you to say. I'm not exactly saying that, but I'm saying that's something that we need to think about, we need to look at and take responsibility for. And I take responsibility for it by being an anti-racist activist full time, full stop, for the rest of my life. There's other responses which people make, which is like, well, that's a lie. That's not true. I don't believe you. How dare you say that? Let me qualify this a little bit, okay? There is what we call today intersectionality, and it's other activists and theorists that have come ahead of us that have even allowed us to have a concept like intersectionality that says there are other factors: your gender, your geography, where you were born. Are you differently abled? And do you love? Are you a heterosexual or are you non-heterosexual? How much education? Do you have a PhD, or are you just a high school dropout? Are you rich or are you poor? There's many aspects of what we have come to call social location that influence your ability to perform successfully in this society. And so race is not the only factor determining systemic cultural advantages. There are other factors that determine systemic cultural advantages. But that's not to say that these advantages don't exist and that people who are born into an advantageous position do not, benefit from that, directly benefit from that. So back to Reverend Wallace. He says, white people need to stop talking so much. Something obviously your professor needs to work on. Stop defending the systems that protect and serve us, and stop saying, I'm not a racist. If white people want to turn a blind eye to systems that are racially biased, we cannot be absolved from the sin of racism. If white people turn a blind eye to systemic racism, they themselves are not absolved from racism. If you actively criticize systemic racism and get involved in active anti-racism, you're not absolved. I mean, we're all humans. We all make mistakes. But you are asking yourself, you're requiring yourself to try to get on the right side of history on this particular issue. I'm going to get into a slightly more advanced theological concept now that's called the powers. And this comes from a professor called Walter Wink, and he wrote about this extensively. And this comes from writings that he did that's influenced by the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul talks about the powers and the principalities. Okay, I believe that's, I think that's in Ephesians. I should have the Bible verse, but Professor Wink talks about the powers and the principalities. And so this is where we get into, so we have the triplicates: racism, militarism, and materialism. Well, these are embedded in systems. And what Wink theorizes is that the systems have personality, okay, and that they act autonomously. So when you blame it on, quote, the man, that's what he's talking about. Blame it on the government. This is actually what Wink is saying. It's okay to blame it on the government. I mean, that shouldn't have become so coded as one side versus the other side is allowed to say that. It's an institution. It's fallen. It's not perfect. It makes mistakes, and it has inherent flaws. So this is what Professor Wink says. He says this overarching network of powers is what we're calling the domination system. So this is anywhere where hierarchy is normal, and some people get dealt on the bottom, and some people get dealt on the top. You draw straws in the accidental birth lottery. You didn't choose where to be born. You didn't choose to be born in, in Detroit or Cleveland or Tennessee or wherever you were born, right? So the domination system is characterized by unjust economic relations, oppressive political relations, biased race relations, patriarchal gender relations, hierarchical power relations, and the use of violence to maintain them all. That if you cross these lines, there will be consequences that you could be possibly, harmed for that. You could be possibly placed in incarceration. You could possibly go for a ride in the back of a patrol car. We're not born as dominators, but Wink says that we all have a learned preference for domination. Some people get a taste of power and they actually enjoy it, and they're like, "Hey, I want some more of this. This cocktail of power tastes really good to me. I wouldn't mind having more power." And so Professor Wink says that we have all had the opportunity to be inculcated into the intoxication of power, and that this is something that we need to voluntarily relinquish. We need to die, he says, to things as racism, patriotism, greed, and homophobia. We must, in short, die to the domination system in order to live authentically. If you're carrying around a backpack full of boulders and you're trying to run a sprint, you're going to run that sprint a lot faster without that backpack of boulders. So imagine that we're all, like Sisyphus, weighted down with this huge backpack full of rocks and boulders. And what Wink is saying is that these systems such as racism, patriotism, greed, and homophobia are weighing us all down, and we need to get them out of our backpack to be free. And that this psychological prison that Dr. King is talking about in the first quote is it harms everybody. And that's the that's the wonder of this thing. Racism hurts everybody. It hurts the oppressor as well as the oppressed. According to Professor Wynant, there are four categories that white folks find themselves in relation to this topic of race. And he says all four are going to be in either white supremacy, neoconservative post-racial, progressive colorblind, or abolitionist race traitor. And this is the posture of the white American intellectual activist and so on. And Professor Wynant, I think, would agree with me that the majority of people we know probably live in some version of neoconservative, post-racial, or progressive colorblind. I must tell you that I was probably raised to be progressive colorblind. I bet a lot of you were raised to be progressive colorblind. I think despite this lecture, a lot of you might decide that the progressive colorblind is the much better, safe place to be. And some of you might be neoconservative, post-racial. These are safe places. These are places that America already is. There's a very well-worn groove that you can get into that would be either point 2 or 3. Overt white supremacy is on the upsurge today. It's having a resurgence, but most Americans are as repulsed as I am by overt white supremacy, and as repulsed as you probably are, and they probably would be embarrassed to know that they have a friend who's involved in that. And so whether they are neoconservative, post-racial, or progressive colorblind, which have a lot in common, they're probably going to publicly disavow white supremacy. There's a fourth option that's called an abolitionist race traitor. And that's what I am, and that's what I want to be. That's what I aspire to be. But there seems to be among activists almost a kind of, a kind of performative desire to get the analysis correct when you're in groups talking about these topics. And because I've studied this for years, I can probably talk a really good talk. But one of the things that I think myself as an abolitionist and other fellow white abolitionists have to acknowledge is it's not about us performing a good critique because we've read a lot of brilliant analyses on this topic. It's about embodying struggle and taking risks for struggle where long-lasting and sustainable change to liberate those who are oppressed will actually happen, and so that these systems will be transformed or eradicated, or something's going to happen to bring us into the beloved community. So white supremacy, the key phrases are America First nationalism, isolationism, anti-communism, and white supremacy as an all-American idea that Americanism is the same thing as white. And I hate it, but this is on the rise. I don't mean to offend anybody or to bring out a pitchfork here, but the red hats are a part of this. The red hats were always a part of it, and they want to be a part of it, and so there's certain people that have chosen this as their ideology, and they're not hiding it. So I don't think it's wrong for me to say that's what they're doing, because they told you that's what you're doing. What the way they acted on January 6th, believe them when they said they wanted to kill these people. Okay, believe them when they said they wanted to change the outcome. Believe what they did, that when they murdered that black police officer. Believe them. that they did that and they did it on purpose. That's not really what happened. It was a Sunday in the park. It was a peaceful protest. No, don't game me like that. But there was a time until about 6 years ago, and nobody would have acknowledged any of these things. Unfortunately, these things are on the upsurge in polite company today. Neoconservative post-racial definitely believes in the preservation of white advantage. They might use different buzzwords or different code words to talk about this, but they believe in universal individualism. They believe in that in private, enterprise. That this is the pull them up by the bootstraps kind of thing. Anybody can be president if he just works hard enough. There are no structural differences. It's every man or woman for themselves, but in these people's case, it's usually a man. But they believe in this kind of universal liberty. Everybody can be great. There really is no. So in essence, these are the people who take that one King quote out of context every year. These are the people that say, "Judge me by the content of my character and not the color of my skin." The neoconservative post-racial, they've learned their game, but what they want to do is they want to preserve the systems that perpetuate systemic injustice, and they have no problem doing that because they don't even believe that systemic injustice exists. They might not even believe that system itself that they're perpetuating exists. They're naive or oblivious to their complicity in it, or they've reoriented their rhetoric, and they've taken the spotlight, turned it around, and they're shining the spotlight on these other groups and saying, well, no, actually, you're the problem, and let me show you where all the ways in which you're wrong. Progressive colorblind. I said this is where a lot of us come from. I think this is a lot of where a lot of people would like to be. Maybe this is better than abolitionism. I don't know, but the liberal left progressive ideology of progressive colorblind is that really what we just need to do is have universal health care and universal paid leave, and we need to have free college for everyone. We need to get the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. We need to abolish student debt, and if we take care of these economic problems, we lift up the bottom tier of society. We'll have freedom, and race, or what they'll call it identity politics. They won't actually say something racist. They'll just say, well, I don't believe in identity politics, and so don't talk to me about your female stuff, or don't talk to me about your black stuff. We're all in this together. And if you have a performative white activist performing progressive colorblindness, good for them that they understand that the economic system needs to be reformed, right? But if they're not a queer person, or if they're not a disabled person, or if they're not a female person, if they're not a person of color, they don't know what that's like to live in those bodies that have been the source of this conflict for generations. And so I don't ask any other people to join me on this. I'm not evangelizing this, but this is the place that I feel the most truth is, and the most honest Kingian critique belongs, is to admit that whiteness is completely made up, and it was made up by white people to create a power structure that they were in charge of. And so I surrender. I give up. I don't claim it. I repent from it. I don't wish it didn't happen. It happened for a reason. Our accidental birth assignments happened for a reason. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of my parents or of the hard work they did in the movement or whatever. But I come from a lineage of activists who have addressed this problem at the core of their being. And I believe, that, God or Jesus or whomever is in charge asked me to do it, and so I'm just following orders from the divine, and I'm doing it voluntarily, and I'm surrendering, my right to be right. I might be wrong about this. I might be wrong about a lot of things. But I'm not claiming power for myself based on these artificial accidental birth assignment privileges, because I don't believe in it. And so the saying of the abolitionist is, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. White privilege creates the colorblind class analysis and ignores intersectional race. These are the problems now with all these positions. The white privilege creates the colorblind class analysis and ignores intersectional race, gender, and heteronormative issues. Race traders and those who hyper-confess privilege, sin, complicity can become smug or self-congratulating white people who get it. So So not only am I joining this last club, but then I don't need a sticker. I don't need a gold star for it. I don't need a trophy or an award for that. And I'm performing it right now because I'm trying to teach it in this class. But it's not about me. It's about collective human liberation. And for me, it's also about liberation of other species, and the biosphere and all of God's creation on planet Earth needs liberation. So it's for everything and for everybody. Okay, so this last section of this part of the talk is on theology in the South at the time that King was active. Now, I had a student say to me during this class, a much older student who grew up at the tail end of this period, and he was an adult student coming back to Tech just to take classes. And I love this gentleman, and we were good friends. He was a very intelligent gentleman, and he said no churches actually preached white supremacy, did they? And I actually didn't have a perfect example for him, so I did a lot of extra work looking up how the white citizens councils, which you're going to learn about the white citizens council in the movie tonight. I did a lot of extra work learning about where the white citizens councils went to church and what they were hearing at church. And we found out that they actually did believe that the Bible is for white people and that the Bible worships a white God, that Jesus was white, and that they had sermons, Sunday school classes, radio shows, literature, organizations, and legislations to fight segregation, to preserve segregation. I'm sorry, to fight desegregation, to preserve segregation, to say the separation of the races is the way God intended it. And they promoted white supremacy through church, straight up. This is a quote from a book. They said, race mixing is a religious fraud, used much of the same material as an attempt to answer religious race mixers who advocated integration. This admonished in his closing paragraphs, is your denomination helping to push us down the devil's highway of integration? So racial justice and equality is the way of the devil, period. White supremacy is the way of Jesus. That's what these people were teaching. I mean, and they changed, and evangelicals today have changed a lot on this topic. But now that three-word bogeyman has been introduced, the three words I won't even bear to say, now that these new dog whistles and these new panics have been brought into the cultural discourse, the church is falling apart around this issue because for a little while, right? For a little while, because of Dr. King, we saw the church make progress on this topic. We saw Christians try really hard to live a Galatians 3:28 existence. And I went to churches my whole life that tried to practice a Galatians 3:28 existence. But the problem we find is still on Sunday morning, that Sunday morning at 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour in America, and that our churches are segregated. And so really, and there's a whole section of this I've left out, which is Black liberation theology. We'll get to that a little bit later. James Cone and Jeremiah Wright and some of these other folks. But a very different gospel is being preached in the Black church from the gospel that's being preached in the churches where these white citizens councils were going, and possibly a different gospel in the liberal church. And people were tuning their interpretation of the Bible to politics, not using their interpretation of the Bible to guide their political decisions. And that's the problem. And I hate to say it, but people on the left are guilty of this as well. People are taking if you're religious, your interpretation of Scripture and your love for Jesus and the love of Jesus should guide your politics. You shouldn't allow your politics to adjust your interpretation of Jesus. But that's what's happened, and that's the way it is. That's pretty much the only way it is now. And you can pick and choose. I could even tell you in Cookeville which churches you're going to see different versions of this today in Cookeville. So this book called Mississippi Praying showed that these churches were preaching segregation is right, it's Christian, it ought to be taught at home, preached from every pulpit and state in the nation. And so we got this idea that evangelical Christianity was synonymous with political conservatives, and it supported racial segregation. And they said things like God directed the genealogy of Christ that the bloodline might be kept pure. And so they believe that God is white, Jesus is white, and all this other kind of foolish nonsense. These are the citizens councils, which we're going to see in the movie that we're going to watch tonight. Had 85,000 members in Mississippi and 65 chapters, 250,000 members nationally. It was led by white Presbyterians, white Methodists, and white Baptists. They promoted publicly with opinion editorials in the newspapers, cartoons, letters to the editor, articles. And they tried to discredit liberal theology and discredit integration. They discredited King as well, okay? And the churches that King preached in. We have found that if a person is white, joins the movement, and participates in abolition work, and participates as an ally and as accomplice, will also be hated for this, and will be excluded from their own privilege. They will have to sacrifice some of their own privilege. White people will risk everything, including death, including the martyrs in the movement. In the civil rights movement, we had black martyrs and white martyrs, people who died for the cause of civil rights in this country. Famous white martyrs included Viola Liuzzo, a woman from Detroit, who traveled to the Selma movement and was murdered. James Reed, a Unitarian minister who traveled to the Selma movement and was murdered. Dr. King himself said that allies in the white community recognize the urgency of the moment. He says this new militancy must not lead us to the position of distrusting white people. So he said to his black friends, we should not distrust white people. He said, there are white people in this country who are determined to see us free as we are to be free. And so King was an integrationist. King had white advisors and white allies, and he worked in the black community and in the white community. What we've been asked to do by people in the movement and by people who are black leaders in the civil rights movement, we've been asked to offer respect. We've been asked to listen. We've been asked to learn. We've been asked to not make assumptions. We're asked to stand and walk side by side, not to assume that we know what's best, to provide resources and money, to take risks, to make mistakes, to not take it personally if we get criticized, to talk to other white people, to teach your children about these topics, to interrupt jokes and comments, to speak up, to don't ask you to be the one spokesperson for your people. I certainly don't speak for all the white people in Cookville. There's some that want my job, you know. I get hate mail for talking like this, just saying. So put your body on the line and persevere daily. Assume that racism does exist, that it's real. Notice who is the center of attention and who is the center of power in all the groups that you're in. Notice how racism is denied, minimized, or justified. Understand and learn from the history of whiteness and racism. Understand that the connections between racism, economic issues, sexism, and other forms of injustice, that everything is connected. Dr. King said an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He believed in the interconnectionality of these topics. Take a stand against injustice. Try to be strategic. Don't confuse a battle with the war. Don't call names or be personally abusive. Support the leadership of people of color. Learn something about the history of white people who have worked for racial justice. And don't do this alone. This is community work. This is work that we do in community and with colleagues and comrades and folks that are aligned for the same purposes. You can choose to be an anti-racist. Beverly Tatum said there's overt racism, passive and subtle racism, and active anti-racism. You cannot, according to Beverly Tatum, be a passive anti-racist. Being an anti-racist white person requires you to take a stand and to take action. If you sit on the sidelines, you're participating in racism, according to Beverly Tatum. Okay, so we join the struggle, and you know, are we absolved? No. Are we free of guilt? No. Are we perfect? No. Are we the leaders? No. We're partners. It's a partnership model. We're co-conspirators. Jim Wallace said, if there's white racism and it's in a white institution, that white people are responsible for eradicating it. And so I've committed myself to this work at Tennessee Tech. I've committed myself to abolishing racism within Tennessee Tech and within the churches that I've attended, within my own heart, within my own family. And it's hard work. It's tireless work. It's not fun. And that's the thing, you know, I've heard people say, well, you just do that because it's fun. It's hard work. Are there rewards for doing the right thing? I think if you do the right thing, you will be rewarded, but not in the ways that you think you'll be rewarded. So we've got about 20 minutes, 20 minutes for you guys to ask questions and give feedback before we watch tonight's film, which will bring up all of these topics as the film focuses on the relationship between a white woman and a black woman in the movement in Montgomery, and the white woman is the employer and the black woman is the employee, and so all of these lines of gender, race, class, everything will be addressed in the film The Long Walk Home, with the great Whoopi Goldberg and the great Sissy Spacek in the starring roles. But I'm going to stop my recording and encourage you guys to participate in about 15 minutes of feedback before we move to the film. And as always, you are free to